Good morning and a warm welcome to today's webinar, Coping with Loss. This is the fifth in our This Can Happen series of webinars, which is aiming to support you and your colleagues and families with a series of webinars. So my name's Susie. Oh, I think I've said that, sorry. So before we start, I'm going to just quickly run through how this webinar will work for those who might not have participated before. So our speaker, Chloe, will talk to you for about 50 minutes and you'll be able to follow along on your screen, and then we'll move on to questions at the end. We will be sending you the slides and a recording of the session afterwards via email, so please don't worry if you miss anything. You will receive it all, because I know we all have probably more distractions going on in our life than usual, especially with schools going back. So you can ask a question at any time during the session, and Chloe really does encourage you to do so. All you need to do is type it into the question box on the right-hand side of your screen. Questions are totally anonymous and they only come to my screen, so please do feel free to contribute in complete confidence. As I said, I will read out your questions at the end, or we can answer them as we go along, depending on what people ask and when. So we will try and get through, and also there were loads which came in advance, so hopefully it'll be a really good interactive session. Okay, so without further ado, it gives me great pleasure to hand you over to our guest speaker today, Chloe.
Hello everybody, I'm Dr. Chloe Paidousas-Mitchell. Thank you, Susie, for that lovely introduction. I'm really looking forward to connecting with you all today. I will speak for about 50 minutes, but as Susie said, if you have any questions, feel free to text them through. And if there are any more personal questions that I haven't got the opportunity to address today, then I'm really happy to give you my time. You can reach out to me via email or on social media. So without further ado, I'll introduce myself a little bit more. I am a chartered UK counselling psychologist. I have a particular interest in understanding traumatic loss and grief. That's what I did my PhD in. And over the years, when I first graduated from my psychology degree, I worked for the BBC and the media industry as an organisational development consultant and a personal development coach. And the more I did work in that field, the more I came into contact with the disruption and the devastation of highly professional, capable people who are having to navigate losses and traumas from working in hostile and catastrophic environments. And the more I did that, the more I thought I really fancy going into a better, deeper clinical understanding of what trauma is and what loss is. And hence now, many years later, I am now a clinician. I run a private practice where I help people overcome mental health difficulties. And I do a lot of work in companies to raise awareness around grief, trauma and loss, and how to support people with that. For the session today, the objectives are to help us understand what we mean when we talk about loss in the current context, to develop some knowledge around, well, what are grief responses and how do we support a colleague in grief? Really importantly, thinking about using the right language, recognizing signs of shutting down and recognizing signs of deteriorating mental health. Now, I wouldn't put grief and loss under a mental health condition. However, if it isn't navigated adequately, if there isn't enough opportunity to process the internal disruption that happens, then it can lead to a mental health condition that can become quite serious. And I'll say a little bit more about that as I progress with my talk today. To start us off, very simply, what is grief? The simplest, most straightforward response to that is that grief is a physical, mental and emotional response to a loss, and normally that loss is due to the death of a person who matters to us. Now, that can be a person obviously that we're very attached to, who's in our everyday lives. There's a significant other, or it can be people that we feel a connection to. Sometimes it can even be a celebrity that we've never met. Grief, however, the response, if you like, the psychological total response to it can be experienced with other losses too, like the loss of a home, divorce, loss of a pet, loss of your health, loss of finances. Now, obviously, what COVID-19 has done is it's put us into face-to-face, if you like, contact with a multitude of losses. The current context in many ways is causing a mass grief response on many, many fronts. If I could have the next slide, please, Susie. I won't say too much because we all have our own personal experience of the crisis and the lockdown conditions, but these seem to be the trends, if you like. Obviously, our daily routines have now gone. We're all having to cope with a blended environment of work and home. Our childcare options have gone. Our social care options have gone. The care that we might have put in place for our elders has gone. Schools are closed. Many people are taking a huge financial hit, so we've lost our financial security. We've lost our freedom, or it's hugely compromised to make life plans. I know I personally have friends and family who live in a foreign country, and I'm finding it quite difficult to tolerate not being able to be for them there, available. And many people are facing disruptions like that. We've lost our health treatments. An awful lot of cancer patients and chronic conditions have had their care put on hold, which is incredibly frightening and distressing. And with respect to kind of coping with actual loss and grief, we are now not able to navigate grief, to conduct the normal kind of end of life grieving procedures that we would. So we're having to learn to cope with grief within very abnormal circumstances, very, very difficult. So all our norms have gone. And at the moment, we're living with a really high level of uncertainty. So none of us can say with any confidence, if you like, what the consequences are going to be, how long this is going to go on for, and actually what lies ahead. The impact of all of this, the wider context on our mental and emotional well-being is fairly significant. Now, I don't want to trigger fear in people. I just want to sort of set the scene that when we're talking about understanding loss and supporting colleagues who are returning to work after a loss, we need to take this wider context into consideration too. On my next slide, you will see that I have a quote, which I think is relevant, from the Every Mind Matters campaign. The NHS have got a fantastic set of slides, if you like, and tools for you to access if you need further support. I'll say a little bit more about that at the end. So here's a quote that I thought gives us a little bit more of a framework. The coronavirus outbreak means that life is changing for all of us for a while. It may cause you to feel anxious, stressed, worried, sad, bored, lonely, or frustrated. What's really important is to remember that it is okay to feel this way and that everybody reacts differently. What we are expecting as a mental health professional, as a sort of key worker myself, what I've been warned to prepare for is an unprecedented wave of raw grief, post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, and anxiety. So what I want to say, what I'd like you to take away from this is just an awareness that everybody will navigate this particular crisis personally. However we respond in grief is a personal matter, and it is normal to feel disrupted, to feel like we have a lot of difficult feelings to navigate. The people who are under risk, the higher risk, there is research coming out of Sheffield University. I know the Lancet last week published a number of studies just to sort of help us consider this, particularly when you're supporting colleagues who are dealing with loss. People under 35, people living alone, single parents, people with existing mental health conditions, and people who are coping with trauma, abuse, or neglect. Now, of course, I'm sure you've all seen in the news that all of these are on the increase by about 25%, and people taking a huge financial hit. So if you're coping with the loss and you fall within this higher risk conditions, just bear that in mind for yourself or for your colleagues, and make sure that you are holding a compassionate attitude around that. Many people ask me, is all grief the same? And no, I think is the simplest answer. There are different types of grief, and I haven't got time to go into all of these, but just to give you a general kind of gist from a psychological point of view, we have a normal grief, which is a grief that would be characterized, I guess, by the sense that you're processing the loss, you're learning to adapt to it, you're learning to accept it. You go through waves of devastating, profound sadness, but also openings of hope, re-engaging, receiving support. So it's a sort of a state of flux, that you feel like you are progressing, that you are returning to a space where you can re-engage with life. That is a normal grief. A delayed grief is a grief that maybe a lot of people are facing at the moment. It's a grief where the general response is, I haven't got time to deal with this. I can't deal with this right now. Now that does happen a lot, particularly as grief may be happening in very abnormal circumstances now. What will happen with delayed grief is that you will be able to delay it for a while, and then normal grief could proceed. Traumatic grief is a grief that happens, that is unexpected, that is completely sudden, and for which nothing could be done to prevent it from happening. And I think, given what the conditions are and the numbers of people that are now coping with loss, it is likely that people are coping with a traumatic, or also known as a complicated grief. And obviously, I'll say a lot more about that. If you want to know more about anticipatory grief and disenfranchised grief, I'm really happy to do that, but perhaps in another forum, because I'm conscious of the time. But disenfranchised grief might be one to hold on to in case you have colleagues who are coping with the grief that they carry some anxiety around shame, if it's a grief that's happened due to misadventure, or if a loved one has taken their own life. You know, they are more complicated griefs. To focus us in for this morning or this afternoon, depending on where you are, on what do we mean when we say traumatic grief. I really believe, and that is what I'm coming across in my own practice and in all the research I'm looking at, is that many of us are now coping with the traumatic grief, because death by COVID is sudden, it's quite aggressive, it's absolutely terrifying, and nothing can be done to prevent it from happening once it has hit the immune system extremely hard. And all of that meets the, if you like, the clinical definitions of what we mean by a traumatic event. Normal end of life options and conversations and care and support are not possible. And of course, this adds to the traumatic aspect of processing the grief, and end of life conversations and goodbyes are happening digitally, which is incredibly difficult and traumatic. So we do need to be aware that in the current climate, the normal rituals aren't happening. Families can't get together to support each other, and the bereaved won't be distracted with the normal end of life arrangements. That's really something to just bear in mind. So what I want you to take from this is that grief is likely to be more intense because of the situation that we're in, and actually more complicated in terms of adapting and recovering. And when I say recover, I don't mean that you get over it and you're okay with it. It's a process of learning to reconstruct your sense of yourself and your life in a meaningful way. And I will talk a little bit more about that. If a grief is not processed adequately, this can lead to major depression or to symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. And it is really important, if you are picking that up, to reach out to your friends or to your colleagues and to perhaps remind them that the response they're having is a normal response to an abnormal situation, and have they got good enough support in place to help them get through it. Grief happens to everybody in a completely unique way. All grief responses are normal. Everybody goes through it. No two people experience grief in exactly the same way. And it's not possible to go through life without navigating grief at some point. So what I really want to highlight is recovery doesn't really happen in stages. I know the word grief stages is part of our public kind of rhetoric now, but it's really confusing, because people come to me and say, well, I think I've gone through that stage, but I'm back at that stage. So there is no such thing as going through the chronology of grief. Most people go through 7 acts of recovery. I think that's quite a useful framework for understanding them, and they do vary, and they may be different for each and every one of you. So one person might go through the initial shock and disbelief, and then jump into feeling guilt, or might be feeling sadness and loneliness. You know, the seven acts of grief recovery are very, very personal, and we can't really see them as stages, because you dip in and out of all of these probably. And here they are, sort of rather quickly, as the initial shock and disbelief, denial of the truth, guilt about unfinished business, things said that can't be unsaid, feeling angry that the loss has happened, and many people fall into bargaining with God or the the spirits to try and change what has happened, moving on into a place of sadness and loneliness, and appreciating that the loss is really happening. And then eventually, with a grief that is well navigated, we have a turning point, where we start to accept that life can have meaning again. And what is that? And how do we do that? And you move through that to a place of acceptance where you feel that you can integrate into your new way of living, your new world, the person who has gone. Now, that is, in very brief, the kind of the stages of grief. I'm going to go into a lot more detail now in terms of understanding the psychological dimensions of grief. So the grief affects the whole person. Of course, it will do that in a unique way because the context, what's happened to our lives, what our relationships with ourselves are, who we've lost, how we've lost them, all of that contributes. But the bigger picture, if you like, is that when we go through a grief, we have to rediscover almost all of us. So our relationship with being in a mortal body, our relationship with ourselves, our relationships with significant others and with colleagues, our values, our beliefs about life, where we seek comfort, what our spirituality informs us of, what our relationship with nature is, and what our relationship with work is. So grief impacts us in a total way. So when you're supporting a colleague going through grief, it's important to hold in mind that it isn't a simple thing. It's a deeply reconstructing experience that hits us at our core. The physicality of grief is something that I'm not sure many of us talk about, but grief has an absolute physical dimension to it, and it's completely normal to experience physical aspects to grief and loss. And you might be feeling this with all the other losses that I mentioned at the beginning of this webinar. But here are some things that I would see as very normal. You know, an empty, hollow feeling in the stomach, chest pains, having a constricted throat, headaches, becoming noise intolerant, feeling lightheaded, having very low energy, aches and pains. A lot of people, because of the cortisol being released, will actually find that their immune system is taking a hit and they actually get quite ill. Changes in your libido, having shaky hands, finding that your body temperature is changing quite dramatically, hot and cold. Some people find that their sleep is really disrupted, so either they can't sleep at all or they sleep too much, and they use that as a kind of checking out, not wanting to engage, not wanting to emerge in any kind of daily routine. Loss of appetite, feeling nauseous, feeling breathless, feeling like you're going to cry at unexpected moments, not being able to concentrate on anything, and memory loss. Just not remembering what people have said, despite having sort of good intentions and wanting to. Now, the reason I mention that is because I think it's absolutely fundamental when you're supporting a loved one and a colleague through loss that you bear this in mind and you normalize it. So sometimes people are very frightened by the intensity of the physical aspect to grief. They hadn't perhaps appreciated that it has that dimension. So it's just about normalizing it, reassuring yourself and people, and taking care to look after yourself, recognizing and accepting that your grief has a physical aspect is a really important coping. If I could have the next slide, please, Susie. And what we're talking about is accepting it, just tuning into it, and recognizing that it's normal that you have these responses. It's okay. What support do you need to practice good self-care physically? So can you get outside? Can you get mobile? There's an awful lot of research that shows that time out in nature, having a time out in the sunshine, making sure that you're getting good enough sleep, making sure that you've got a fairly decent balanced diet, moderating kind of your alcohol intake. Now, it's just about recognizing that grief has a physical aspect to it, so therefore self-care has to have a physical aspect to it, and you and your colleagues will have their way of dealing with it, but just knowing that can be quite a reassuring anchor to cope. Moving on, obviously grief has a very profound personal and unique emotional side to it, and things that again are completely normal given that loss is happening in very abnormal circumstances. I've listed here for you to have a look at, but we are talking about things such as feeling very numb, feeling very empty, feeling very raw, feeling overwhelmed, feeling fear, feeling anxious, like what now? How much more can I bear of this? Feeling deeply, deeply upset, feeling deeply sad, especially if it was very out of regular timing, if it was very premature, if it was very sudden. The shock is quite profound and it can have such a rippling effect. And it's not like you go through a day of shock and then you're done with it. It comes back again and again, and you dip in and out of these feelings. The emotional aspect of grief is completely disempowering in some way. Feeling rage, feeling angry. Some people will be angry about the virus. Others might feel incredibly angry with the healthcare systems, might feel like they've been let down. Other people will be angry with the government. All of these are quite normal responses to what's happening. Feeling helpless and hopeless, especially if more than one family member is in danger. Feeling guilty for surviving, again, especially if you've gone through the virus and a significant other or a colleague hasn't survived it. Feeling guilty about not being able to arrange a normal funeral. Feeling despair at not being able to have been there at the end to hold your loved one's hand and to support them and care for them how you would have wished to, and just desperate at not being able to have seen this coming or to have done anything to prevent it from happening. So as you can see, I've just listed some examples, and these are turning up in my sessions pretty much almost every day, because you can't go through grief without having an emotional response to it. And if you bottle it up, if you try and compartmentalize it, if you try and pretend you're not having these feelings, what will happen is they'll take residence in your body, they will become more and more powerful, and they come and get you at some other time. So navigating grief really requires us to check in and accept compassionately and with a good, open, loving attitude to ourselves in terms of what is it I'm feeling, and is it okay to feel these raw feelings? And actually it is, and our job, if you like, in supporting colleagues is to be human, to be not judgmental, and to hold an awareness that if they're feeling these things, these are all completely normal responses to an abnormal situation. Further to the emotional and the physical, there is also a cognitive aspect to grief and navigating loss, because when grief happens, our mind has to work really very hard to reconstruct a new kind of reality that feels safe, that feels meaningful and normal. And it's impossible for us to exist in a world that doesn't make sense, because we are conscious, meaning-making creatures. So when a loss happens that is traumatic and devastating, everything is then questioned, and we start to ask big questions that our mind is trying to wrap its head around, like, why has this happened? I never thought this would happen. I don't feel I can process this. I don't think I can cope. This doesn't seem real. When I did my PhD and I looked into the lived experience of traumatic loss, I interviewed many people who all had quite personal and unique experiences of grief, but this was one aspect of it that resonated with everybody, that profound kind of cognitive disorientation of, I don't really understand what is happening. I know it's happened, but it doesn't seem real. So it is completely normal for a person coping with a very significant loss to feel flawed, to feel cognitively, if you like, or mentally disorientated. It doesn't mean that they'll be there forever. It just means that in knowing that, you can hold a compassionate space for them, just to sort of normalize it, because normalizing it gives us a sense of hope. It can give us an anchor to trust that we can navigate through it. And there's only one way to cope with loss, and to go through it, and that is to actually go through it. And that means tuning in to the cognitive, the mental, the emotional, the physical side to it. Normalizing grief responses is the key. I'm not expecting you to become therapists to your friends or to your colleagues, but I do think it's really important that if you can normalize. Can I have the next slide, please, Susie? Thank you. If you can normalize what's happening to them, that really helps them in adjusting and recovering. And what I mean by that is just recognize that there are emotional aspects of grief and loss, and that these are very personal and unique. Don't make judgments about it. Be very accepting. Encourage people to seek support for it, and encourage people to practice good self-care. Again, in big, bold letters, you know, all grief responses are human and are normal. It's the situation that you're facing that is abnormal. Very, very important to recognize that grief is personal. Acknowledging that grief impacts everybody personally is the key. Often people in grief feel really unfamiliar in themselves. They talk about not knowing who they are now. I'm talking about not knowing how to be. They feel very lost. And really, very often, what tends to happen is they start to become critical of themselves, saying things like, I thought I would be over it by now, or I didn't realize that I would respond like this. And they start to judge, if you like, their own handling of grief and their coping mechanisms. And this seems to be particularly prevalent with high achievers and professionals who return to work and find that they can't be as driven or as consistent as they used to be. And of course, this causes them to be even more self-critical and even more confused about who they are. So just hold an open mind when you're supporting a colleague in grief, because grief is absolutely personal. Can I have the next slide, please, Susie? Thank you. We do become what we think, and that's quite important, because what you can hold, if you like, if you're going through a grief yourself or supporting somebody, is that we have a choice. And I see this all the time. As human beings, we have the spirit, if you like, the capacity to find meaning in any experience that life throws at us, even in the face of the most distressing and disrupting events. And what tends to happen is when people engage with their grief, they start to really question, almost on an existential level, like who they want to be, how they're going to find meaning through this. And the sort of questions that your colleagues might be navigating are, how do I want to be through this? How will I imbue my life with purpose and meaning now? What can I learn from this suffering and loss? How can I bear this with dignity and courage? And what support do I need? How will I look after myself through these? Now, if they're asking these questions, they're on to a really good thing. And if you think they're not asking these questions, maybe you can hold them in mind to encourage them to check in with themselves and embrace a positive attitude to accepting their pain, to accepting the rawness of it, and to accepting that there is something that needs to be reconstructed for them now, and that catching it, if you like, or giving yourself permission to reflect on it, is good self-care. It's very normal to fall into feeling dysregulated or disrupted. We're just talking about recognition, if you like, that human beings, and I'm always humbled by people that I speak to who are coping with very difficult loss, of the capacity to rise through it with courage and dignity and purpose and meaning. And that really goes a long way to reassure a loved one or a colleague. In grief, as I was saying, the human spirit can really grow wiser and stronger and more determined, actually, to live a life that feels meaningful and fulfilling. If I could have the next slide, please, Susie. Again, when I was doing my PhD research, that's what came through loud and clear with a multitude of people. Grief can be devastating, but it can also lead to growth. And this happens when the person bereaved recognizes and normalizes their grief responses. So they express their emotions, their thoughts to themselves and to significant others. Getting support is fundamental. That's why therapy works, because there's something very validating, very reassuring and holding when we feel that we are got, that we are understood by a compassionate, non-judgmental other, and reaching out and communicating what our internal experience is, and giving ourselves permission to be human about it, is healing. And if your colleagues are stuck in that, or if they believe that by showing emotions they are weak, then obviously that's something that you can challenge. Adjusting expectations about life and learning to take it one day at a time, most importantly in self-compassion mode, is extremely important for grief recovery, and learning to accept that the loss has happened and that you will find a new way to stay connected with the person who who you've lost. And people have very personal and very meaningful and very unique ways of doing that. But when we work our way through grief, we learn to reconstruct meaning in life through connections and life projects. And that's really, really important because it's a message of hope. It's not an instruction, it's just an awareness that when you're supporting and talking and reaching out to colleagues, coping with this, just bear in mind that there is the possibility that they can navigate this with courage, dignity, and meaning. A lot of people ask me what conditions create mental illness from grief. I mentioned that at the beginning of my talk. What you want to look out for is people who are avoiding feelings of grief completely. Eventually what that does is it leads to shutting down and isolating themselves. And if people do that for a while, that's okay, obviously. That's not a problem. But from a clinical point of view, a person disengaging, not being interested at all in the welfare of significant others, let's say family members or children, and this goes on for more than 2 weeks, then you've got to sort of start to maybe consider if they may be falling into a depressive mindset. And clinical depression can often follow a very traumatic grief. And then, of course, professional support is useful to help carry a person through that. Other behaviors that can contribute to a mental illness from grief is acting out, so drinking excessively, gambling, becoming unpredictable, making major life decisions unexpectedly, spending too much, avoiding work, avoiding support, going a little bit kind of, AWOL, partying, taking drugs, becoming promiscuous, over medicating to numb out. All of these are avoidance behaviors, and I'm not judging anybody for them. They might be what people need to do to tolerate their level of pain and rawness and uncertainty, but obviously if that continues, it becomes very problematic and it contributes to a fairly serious mental illness. And what we want is to prevent mental illness from happening rather than to have to treat it. Self-critical narratives and self-judgment really doesn't help support you through grief. Not sharing the pain of loss with anybody, expecting yourself to go through it alone is not a good idea. Losing sense of meaning and purpose and telling yourself that life feels like there's absolutely no point to it whatsoever, and isolating and not getting professional support. So these are some signs, if you like, that you might be on the lookout for colleagues or loved ones who are perhaps, your instinct is telling you they're not really dealing with the grief as you would have hoped for. Again, it's not about judgment, it's just about catching it, if you like. I'm going to do a really quick reference to what major depression is, because a lot of people worry about that, and depression is on the rise. We have about 1 in 5 adults pre-lockdown diagnosed with depression, with clinical depression. With adolescents, it's 1 in 3, and we are expecting that to rise by a third. So it might be that you will be supporting colleagues who are coping with loss and aspects of depression. So I wanted to give you some idea of what symptoms or what signs you're looking at. And here they are, just a few. Not wanting to engage with significant others in life, feeling very low, hopeless, can't control these. But we're talking about a flat line, so not getting out of bed for 2 weeks, letting go of personal hygiene, becoming very irritable, being intensely negative and internalizing all their angst, avoiding daily routines, feeling numb, feeling like they've checked out, at worst experiencing suicidal thoughts and feeling blocked from engaging in life meaningfully. And again, really high risk behaviors, just dropping out of work, not answering calls, not talking to anybody. If you're worried about a colleague, then it's worth flagging it up and reaching out to them. Moving on, I'm aware of the time, and there's a little bit more to say around how to support colleagues coping with grief. Most importantly, if you like, is just to learn to trust that you can remove the fear of grief. When supporting your colleagues, it's really important to learn to talk about it and to recognize that we're all human, and it's completely normal to experience difficult, negative emotions in the face of loss. My sense is that, and I know colleagues of mine say the same, that there is a conspiracy of silence when it comes to grief. People don't really know how to deal with it, don't really want to talk about it, and are worried. There's probably a lot of good intention. But things that you don't want to do is offer reassurance and a fixing mentality. Remember, it's not about you. If you're supporting a colleague, don't reach out to say things like, oh, you'll get over it, or everything will be okay, or you're young, you'll find someone else, or I know exactly how you feel. All of these can be quite rejecting, unintentionally so, but can be quite triggering for people who are coping with grief, who actually what they need is just recognition of what they're dealing with, acceptance, and a little bit of kind of humane, compassionate holding with it. Acknowledge where they're at, reach out to them and listen. Being present is an absolutely huge deal. Acknowledging that loss has happened, but don't make any demands on them is a really good thing. And if you're a manager, it goes a long way. And people who feel like their colleagues and their managers really get it, really humanely support them with their loss, are much more likely to stay loyal and involved, and even more productive. Actually, there's a lot of research that shows that. What you want to be doing is allow the person who's bereaved to take the lead. Absolutely reach out is really important, but handle it with care and manage the boundary between the person bereaved and work. So ask them what they need, give them a call, send them an email or a text to show that you're considering them, support them. It will go a really long way. If you're a manager, have a chat with them about how they are a valued member of your organization and how you want to support them, and what do they need from you, what would they like you to communicate to the rest of the team. It's really, really important that you reassure them. If I could have the next slide, please. Ask them and reassure them. Ask them what support they need. And a lot of people are worried about bereavement policy, but actually when you're going through the rawness of it, not knowing where you stand within your organization, what your time, what your rights are, can be quite distressing. So inform them and clarify any questions they may have. Don't assume that they don't want to talk about it, because they might do. When life is in chaos, work can be a life raft and familiar structure. And again, don't assume that they're going to want to take loads of time out. Some people want to be able to return to work so that they can feel like they can anchor themselves in the familiarity of it and the distraction of it. It's absolutely personal, so don't make any assumptions. Reassure them that the team will be happy to see them when they're ready to come back. Of course, ask them what they would like to do in honour of the deceased, and if it would be appropriate for your colleagues to participate in that. All of these are very lovely human responses. What you can do in your conversations with your colleagues who are bereaved is empower them by connecting to them on a human to human level. Ask them important questions. Susie, if I could have the next slide, such as, how would you like your colleagues to respond? Would you like to join work sessions for a bit? They might want a staged return. Would it be helpful to work half-time for a while to settle in gradually? Empower your grieving employees, if you like, to choose and respect their choices. And if they're not sure, give them time. Again, as I was saying earlier, it's completely personal and completely individual. So don't make any sweeping assumptions about what would work, what wouldn't work. Just have those conversations. And on the next slide, you'll see that my recommendation is just be patient, check in with them. It does take time. And even a really good return to work has been handled quite well. You can't assume that everything will go back to business as usual, because they'll still be in the grip of an intense grief. And often people can seem really inconsistent. So 1 minute they can be throwing themselves into a big project, and the next they're not coping at all well with an email. And don't interpret that as them having lost their drive or their talent. They're just in the grips of a very difficult, intense grief, and they're doing what they can to cope with it and navigate their new reality. So just hold that non-judgmental mindset, if you like, an attitude, and check in with them as regularly as you feel would be appropriate. I suppose the important thing to take away is to recognize that the bereaved is going through a transformation. Often when people are coping with a loss, they just want to go back to being them, but of course this isn't possible. They can never go back to being who they were before that loss, especially if that loss was very traumatic. So what they're being called to achieve, if you like, is a reconstruction of a self that feels safe, that feels meaningful. And that is absolutely exhausting and destabilizes people. And it affects their ability to focus, it affects their ability to be consistent, and it affects their drive. So don't translate that, especially if you're a manager, into loss of talent or an interest in work. Just recognize and manage their behaviors. And if you do that compassionately, it will really prevent misunderstanding and conflict. And that goes a long way to supporting somebody who's coping with a very difficult loss. Often people in grief, as I was saying, are very self-critical and want their managers or their teams to believe in them, whilst at the same time not putting too much pressure on them. So with our bereaved colleagues, we can give them permission, I think, I quite like that expression, to be both a functioning team member and an incredibly sad, grief-stricken human being. And we all know how to connect on that human to human level. So it's about adjusting our expectations, and that will be a really big relief for the person bereaved, because flexibility gives us a little bit of breathing room, a little bit of kind of, okay, it's all right here. I'm going to be supported. I'm not being fixed and I'm not being judged. Empathy seems to be a fundamental human way of connecting that can really help us cope with most adverse of life situations. I've got a couple of slides to go. I'm aware of the time. I definitely want to make time for questions. I see that I'm having questions, so I will do my best. Some do's, offer empathy, but only if you can bear to hold them with it and be with them in their own emotions. Don't assume that when a colleague is back at work that it's okay for you to jump in there, do a deep dive on kind of how they are and where they are, because that might destabilize them, that might trigger them, and they might have needed to pluck up a lot of courage and a lot of energy to just get to turn up and to cope with facing the day and facing colleagues. So be careful how you offer empathy and bear the rawness. Then don't offer it. It's even more distressing for somebody to be asked a question and then to not actually be held in it. So reach out to them on the phone. Really don't engage with them publicly. So if you're seeing them for the first time in a meeting, don't make a big deal out of it. Just let them know in some other way that you hold them in your thoughts and you're there if they want to talk to you. They may want to, they may not. Just hold an unconditional, non-judgmental attitude. Just try and engage where they're at, because everything is happening digitally now. It's important to give yourself a little bit of time to think about how you want to reach out to your colleagues and how you want to support them and what would be stabilizing and good for you too. Obviously, you can send them an email welcoming them back and letting them know that you're thinking of them. If I could have the next slide, please. Ask them. Again, it's ask them what support they'd like and how they want you to address their loss with the team. This is particularly relevant for managers, and check in with them literally as often as you like, but every couple of weeks seems to be quite a good kind of gauge. I don't know, perhaps you'll have different opinions to me on that, but the message is, I'm here when you need me, I'm thinking of you, and just as empathically stand alongside them in whatever way feels right for you. You got to find your humanity with it. Now, what you don't want to do is, as I was saying earlier, is ask them how they are, how they're feeling, or what happened. Not unless they've actually agreed to have these discussions beforehand, because these kind of questions trigger the rawness of the emotions. They may not want to have to deal with these when they're in work mode. Definitely don't compare what happened to you, what you did, how you thought about it, how you cope. Some people might find that reassuring, but just be careful how you do that, because what it does is it takes you from a place of empathy to a place of sympathy, which is actually quite different, energetically speaking or psychologically. Don't offer optimistic solutions. People want to offer support, but they say things that actually are quite difficult to hear, like time heals. It doesn't. People feel rawness of grief months and months and months, and maybe even sometimes years later. Or saying hopeful things like, "Oh, you'll meet somebody else," or they're not the right things to be saying when somebody's in the grips of grief. Don't rush to offer condolences. Give them time when they're first back, and definitely don't track their progress. Don't make assumptions. Don't think of grief as a sort of one and done. It takes a lot of time, and as I was saying earlier, they will be grappling with the 7 acts of recovery, and they'll be in and out of those stages in inverted commas fairly fairly unexpectedly for them, because you could be in one place 1 minute and then a few hours later you're in a completely different space, because we're always in a state of flux when we're processing grief. Don't ignore them. I know that colleagues, friends, and other professionals in that have shared how devastating it is when you return to work and nobody acknowledges what, your return. You ignored. It's really upsetting. It's very rejecting and really destabilizing. So be careful of that and don't judge, because all grief is personal. And don't be frightened. Don't be frightened to be supportive, and don't be frightened to mention the person who's died. It's really, really reassuring for the person who's bereaved to know that people are acknowledging it. Um, as I was saying before, grief can lead to positives. With good support through grief, if a person feels that they've received good support from their company, it does build loyalty, and it actually deepens our connections. As human beings, we have stronger, authentic connections with others when we feel like we've been really accepted and held in our most vulnerable, in our most real. And having humane connections at work really just promotes the work environment in all sorts of ways, because everybody feels safe, everybody feels connected, everybody feels acknowledged and held, and more likely to be a better team actually as a result of that. And there is actually a huge energy that comes from surviving a difficult grief. People often don't give themselves space to acknowledge that, but when you've coped with something incredibly difficult and devastating and painful, when you come through to the other side, you feel stronger, you feel wiser and more resilient. And it's really important to acknowledge that, yes, grief is awful, it's very painful, it's really a huge task to reconstruct one's way of being themselves and of life. But it can, with the right support, with the right attitude, lead to an awful lot of creativity and positive shifts in life. Of course, you can't heal people through their grief. All you can do is be there for them. So taking personal responsibility for how we navigate grief is really important. And it is aided, massively so, when we understand grief and when we learn to practice good self-care. Now, there's a multitude of people out there, loads and loads of professionals that are there to offer support. I've named a few here just for your reference. Some mental health apps, things like Unmind, Headspace, Calm, they're all quite good to remind people to check in, to tune in with their mental health, to recognize kind of where they are with the emotions. And the point of that is that when you recognize them and you accept them compassionately for yourself, you can then start to moderate them. You can start to release them, you can start to share them, you can start to make sense of them, and actually that can be really, really facilitating in moving forward. If you feel like you haven't got the right support because you don't want to burden your family, or because it's all having to be done digitally, then there are many organizations offering support, people like the Bereavement Cruise organization, a lot of professionals, people on the counselling directory and the BACP directory are all properly registered and qualified and vetted. Just be careful where you go for support, because you need to make sure that they are going to be properly working within a professional ethics framework. If anybody wants to talk to me, obviously reach out to me. Be really happy to answer any questions, especially personal ones that you might think, okay, I don't really want that mentioned on the forum, but I wouldn't mind Chloe's unit. Then do feel free to reach out to me. I'm more than happy to share my knowledge. And that's it, really. Thank you so much. I hope that that's been meaningful and useful for you. And I want to open it up for questions now. If you wouldn't. Susie, can you hear me? Are there questions coming in?
Yes, thank you so much. That was fantastic. I'll just get straight into them because there are a few to get through. Great seminar. Why would you say that under 35s are in a higher risk group?
Okay, the under 35s often are concerned about job security, are concerned about financial security, and perhaps having a more negative outlook on what their chances are of having a good future. And often under 35s can be single, living alone, and if they're not practicing good self-care, and if they're not reaching out to have good shared connections with people through digital technologies, that puts them in the higher risk category. But I can send the link if the group would like, to the study from Sheffield University, which goes into a lot more detail around the reasons for that.
Great, thank you. Are there any techniques to help with the physical aspects of grief, i.e. breathing exercises?
Yeah. That's a really good question. Thank you for sharing it. Yes, any kind of breathing exercise is going to activate that part of the brain that reduces the stress hormones, adrenaline, cortisol, or noradrenaline. Now, tons and tons of meditation and mindfulness studies have shown that when we go through a loss, we are activated neurologically as well, because we perceive the threat and our world no longer feels safe. So it is normal. The physical symptoms are happening to you or to your loved ones because your nervous system is in a fight or flight mode. So breathing, returning to the breath, is a fantastic anchoring, grounding way to slow down the nervous system's responses to the pain and to the perceived threat and to the loss. So any kind of exercises that allow you to fill your lungs, take time to pause, will deactivate the stress hormones. And I can send some exercises through to the group that would be helpful. There are a lot of meditation videos on YouTube. The Calm app, the Headspace app have got fantastic meditation exercises. There's one I really like that I do personally, which is very, very quickly I can share here today, is take some time, sit comfortably, accept where you're at, take some time to fill your lungs, count to 3, and whilst you're filling your lungs, tell yourself that you're breathing in love, or something positive anyway, something that feels healing. And it is whatever words work for you. For me, the word love seems to be what it's all about, and that's what I work on. So I hope that's okay to share with everybody today. And when you release your breath, what you do is you breathe it out, you empty your lungs, and you think to yourself, I am breathing out pain, which is a way of sending your unconscious a message that you are releasing. You're releasing the rawness, you're releasing the negativity, you're releasing the pain. And somehow that message, for me, is quite an anchoring message. But again, there are many breathing exercises that are useful, and I can compile a list and send it to the group if that would be helpful.
Thank you. I'm sure that'd be very helpful. Hi, I've read and heard from several sources that it takes 1 year to go through grief before it becomes normalised, in inverted commas. What's your opinion on this?
I would be careful and cautious of any time frames put on grief, because, as I was saying earlier, all grief is personal. How you respond has a lot to do with what your circumstances are, what your attitude is about your own internal world, what support you have, what's happening in the outside world, and particularly now in the current context, what hits you're taking. And for one person, one grief might feel like it took 6 months, and for another person it might feel like it took 2.5 years. So I would be cautious of trying to set a time frame. I don't think time heals. I know that's a little bit of a strange thing to say. I think we heal ourselves, and checking in, allowing ourselves to process the rawness of our emotions is a very unique journey, and for one person it can be more intense to another. So just be careful. Of course, if you're feeling intense grief a year later, I would say that's normal. That's quite normal. I wouldn't say it's abnormal to feel it 16 months later or 2 years later. So I guess I'm very cautious about the timeframes that people like to impose on grief. Just be careful about that.
Thank you. What is the best way to support a child who hasn't been able to say goodbye to her nana due to COVID?
Gosh, that's a really, really difficult and important question, because so many people are having to deal with this. I probably need more time than I've got for today, but the headlines, if you like, are: make time to check in with them, allow them to feel whatever they're feeling. Again, all grief responses are normal. Be truthful with them, explain to them what has happened in truth. If the child is asking about death, that means that they're ready to try and wrap their heads around it. Obviously, do it in an age-appropriate fashion, but allow them to ask as many questions as they want. Explain to them how you're feeling and normalize your feelings, and obviously do it in a way that is age appropriate. But what you're doing by that is modeling that if you can cope with grief and if you can cope with sadness and difficult feelings, and you can model that for them, then they can too. And children look to their caregivers for reassurance. Another thing to bear in mind with children is they don't process grief in exactly the same way as adults do. So they can have a very intense, raw grief response 1 minute, and half an hour later seemingly seem completely unfazed, normal, back to kind of playing. That is how children cope with it. They dip in and out of it in measurable kind of psychological chunks, if you like. So just bear that in mind. It's completely normal for a child to regress, to not be able to verbalize what they're feeling, to be confused, and to start saying things like, I've got a stomachache, I've got a headache, to start to become maybe quite naughty, pushing boundaries, pushing all your buttons. Again, all of it probably related to grief. There are some really good charities that support children coping with grief, and Jigsaw is one of them, and Place to Be is another. Many good resources out there. But yeah, just learning how your child is responding to the loss and normalizing it, and just giving them time to share it, process it. If they can't talk about it, invite them to draw it, invite them to act it out in play. Anything that allows them to process it and to feel safe in it is a good way forward. Yeah, I think that's all I'm going to say on that. Thank you.
Thank you. So I think we've probably only got time for one question. I'm really sorry we can't get through them all. Having lost a parent last year, how do you manage anxiety about the health of your remaining parent's health who falls into the vulnerable category?
It's a really good question. And again, you know, so many of us have parents that we're worried about, or elderly relatives and friends that we're worried about. What I would say is, with anxiety, it's important to give yourself whatever anchors you need to get through it. You can't control what happens outside of you. You hope that people are taking good measure and good care. But what you can control is how you respond. So one way to deal with anxiety is to check in with yourself every day. I do this personally, actually, just to help me cope with the level of uncertainty and difficulty around. Get a journal it out if that works for you. What that tends to do is that in the process of sort of, you know, thinking and writing, you discover what's going on for you internally. And by doing that, you start to accept it, you start to recognize it, and you start to think, okay, well, how can I cope with this? What do I need to do to support myself with this feeling? Normalize it and reframe it if you can. So do I have to feel like that? Is there something I can do to help me reduce that feeling? It's about giving yourself space to recognize what will give you agency, what will give you a sense of controlling your internal response. To expect yourself to not have anxiety through this is not possible. Of course you're going to be anxious. It's a really difficult time and we're all really worried. So again, tune in, allow it to communicate with you. It's trying to tell you something important. And again, reassure yourself that how you're handling it is good enough. And if you feel like you're overwhelmed or you need more support, then reach out to professionals who can give you some more detailed, more personally tailored coping tools and techniques.
Great. Okay, thank you so much, Chloe, for your wise but positive advice on a very difficult subject. We've had loads of comments just saying how helpful it's been and what a great seminar, so webinar even. Thank you.
How amazing. I'm really grateful. Really good to be able to do this. And thank you so much for your time, everybody.
Yeah, thank you. So just quickly to say, you will, sorry, a lot of people have said this as well, you will receive this tomorrow via email, so you can refer back to it probably in the next 24 hours. A brief evaluation sort of report will pop up on your screen, a form. It'd be really helpful to us if you wouldn't fill it in. It's just really helpful at the moment, especially with all the sort of COVID, you know, sort of themes that we're answering what you want. So please do fill that in. Finally, the next in the This Can Happen series, webinars will be on the 1st of May, 11:30, Managing Mental Health in These Challenging Times. So that is enough from me. Thank you very much. I'm now going to end the webinar.
Thank you, Susie.
Thanks, Chloe.
Bye.
Bye.